Welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. Now, as the world's most influential economies gather under South Africa's G20 presidency, one critical voice that is shaping the global agenda comes not from the national capitals, but from the world's cities. Now, this brings in the Urban 20, or also known as the U20, and together with mayors and urban leaders from across the G20 nations to ensure that the priorities of cities, from climate resilience to housing to inclusive economic growth, are discussed with regards to this. So joining me now, I'd like to welcome Zayd Ebrahim, who is a Group Executive Head of Strategy, Policy Coordination, but most importantly, he is the U20 Sherpa. Zayd, assalamu alaikum, and shukran so much for joining us here on Mzansi Welcomes the World.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, Zayd. Zayd, can you briefly just break down what the Urban 20 is and how it fits within the broader G20 framework?
Okay, thank you so much again for having us. I think it's an important conversation, especially when we're talking about cities, in the context of the G20. Now, the U20 or Urban 20, in simple terms, is the mayor's voice within the G20. So it's an official G20 engagement group. It's one of the 13 engagement groups. It's co-convened internationally by the United Cities and Local Government, as well as the C40 cities that's dealing with issues around climate change. The U20 as a sort of formal engagement group is in its 8th cycle. So it's really been only established since 2017. And that's really where cities came together to say, how can we, within the context of, the issues facing many cities in terms of climate change or inclusion, or the issues you raised, economic growth, inclusivity, be championed at the Leaders Summit and to take that sort of urban voice forward. So really, the Urban 20 complements many of the other engagement groups like the B20 or the W20 or the T20 or whichever ones are there. But they really focus on urban governance issues, infrastructure, finance, local implementation of some of the global SDGs and those goals as well. And really, it works very closely with the G20 Sherpa track, so that we have to ensure that, the outcomes of what is developed in a U20 setting fundamentally shapes, the global agendas that are facing cities, either the Paris Agreement or the SDGs or the new urban agendas, or many of these as they evolve as well, in that sense.
Zayd, from the role of South Africa, and particularly its cities within the U20, how much of that does South Africa really need to take in terms of making sure that it leads from the front when it comes to urbanization and the role that it plays within its cities?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that this is the first time that the G20 has been held on the African continent, hosted by South Africa. So the South African presidency of the G20 is really crucial in championing that global South voice. Not to say that it hasn't been there, but what it does is it also adds on the African voice and the continental voice in terms of, this particular presidency. So any urban-related issues or urban aspects of what would be taken into the Leaders Summit and subsequent to that as well is really shaped by what then we could say continentally and from the global south would be relevant to us. So Johannesburg and Tshwane co-hosted the Urban 20 Summit in 2025. Tshwane hosted an initial summit of Sherpas in June, and Johannesburg hosted the Mayoral Summit in September 2025. The one key outcome of the U20 is to develop a communique. Now, that communique essentially is that declaration that emerges from these particular summits that really say, how do we reflect the priorities of this cycle? How do we elevate it to the level of the Leaders Summit? And how then are our big issues as now cities from the global south or cities from the African continent using this presidency to channel and ensure that those experiences are elevated to the G20 and hopefully even beyond. So this presidency provided really, African metros and cities with that visibility and that global visibility to ensure that, that institutional and urban recognition within the G20 decision-making chain has been part of what is expected for us. So the communique ultimately dealt with, with these priorities, and that's where South Africa's role in lobbying for, negotiating, and really managing this process through this urban engagement group of the U20 is what we're taking forward from there.
Zayd, one of the key themes that have come from obviously the U20 has been sustainable and resilient cities. I know there's been a big push, especially here in Johannesburg, to make the residents love the city again. I know there have been a lot of projects that have been occurring, whether it's Maboneng Precinct or Braamfontein, to try and get people back to loving the city again. Obviously, we've seen a lot of decay, a lot of destruction within infrastructure of the city. Is this something that, the U20, along with many of the G20 think tanks, are saying, we need to get back the love of the city for the residents, whether it's here in Johannesburg, whether it's in Tshwane, whether it's even in Cape Town or eThekwini, to try and just get back the love for the city that was once there, a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a much more subjective way of looking at it. I suppose in relation to what the Urban 20 as an engagement group actually looks at. I mean, you're dealing with, again, cities such as New York, London, Milan, Barcelona, to name but a few of your global cities. It's really, what do we learn from these various cities that help us shape, the agenda that South African cities have to deal with? I mean, just to list a few of the issues, we currently have a climate emergency, and there are resilience gaps between, what, happens in terms of urban adaptation against, having infrastructure that's resilient. There are urban finance deficits, how cities need to manage the way they actually receive in terms of their public finance share. And how then do we also deal with issues around immigration, housing inequality, inclusive growth, jobs, decaying infrastructure, mobility, sustainable, inclusion from technological points of view, or whatever else it might be. So these issues that you raise in terms of, having affection for the city, etc., are global issues. Because when you talk about issues around migration, you've got to ensure that those who come to your city are also feeling welcome and are part of the city, but also become, through systems and legalized platforms, ensuring that they look after the same city. So really, fundamentally, the behavior of citizens and how we see our cities as urban residents, I think trumps what any Urban 20 or G20 really would stand for. But it's really how we create urban environments that are livable, manageable, inclusive. And those are the lessons where, we derive some benefit from understanding how other cities around the world have dealt with similar issues. And that's been one of the sort of underlying factors. Not to say we have so many problems that we cannot solve it, or that these problems are intractable, or whatever else it might be, but acknowledging, what our particular context has been and why we need to deal with these particular problems, and how do we benefit from understanding, where to lever these opportunities within the G20 has become a real driving force for us in this sort of cycle of the Urban 20.
Zayd, before we go to the break, what's interesting about having this conversation on this day is because obviously Zohran Mamdani became the new New York mayor, and he himself said that there are challenges that are happening in New York City, and we're talking about a developed city like over that. So when you mention, of course, this is a global phenomenon, I think that conversation is important, isn't it? That even a city like New York isn't at a level where you'd like to be at this moment.
Well, all cities have similar problems because people make cities. Cities are not formed by institutions or technologies or abstract issues. It's how we manage the challenges that people have to confront in particular issues. How these issues become politicized, or how they get dealt with through the various ways in which cities are are responding, I think, has become, where the hot topic is. But maybe the important point, and that's really, cities are, or mayors are basically seen to be as important as presidents now in shaping global agendas, because that's really where, the closest form of engagement with any formal process happens at the level of a city. And 7 out of 10 South Africans are urbanized in the world. In many of these areas, you're looking at over 85% to 95% urbanization. That cities have become so important to the lifeblood of economies, to society, to all sorts of other trajectories that people find themselves dealing with in cities. So, correctly said. Doesn't mean that we are the only ones dealing with these challenges. Sometimes a housing problem in a first world country will have roots that span multiple continents and countries and demographics and whatever else it might be, but the problem still remains the same. But the solutions, I think, are where the shared learning comes from, and that's where the U20 again fits into this conversation, in terms of how we dealing with urban challenges as well.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Zayd Ebrahim. We're going to be touching on climate adaptation, green infrastructure, sustainability, mobility, all key to, of course, the urbanization that we are experiencing within our country. Do stay tuned to Mzansi Welcomes the World. Welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. I'm in conversation with Zayd Ebrahim, who is the Urban 20 Sherpa. Again, Zayd, shukran so much for staying with us. Zayd, in terms of climate adaptation, green infrastructure, sustainable mobility, how are African countries and, of course, African cities, I beg your pardon, and South African cities contributing to this global discussion?
Well, I mean, the climate agenda has not been something that's new to our conversation in terms of African cities. A large part of, industrialized nations and your sort of first world global cities have been your major polluters, your major greenhouse gas emitters. And then on the other hand, there are sort of your African cities and your developing cities or cities in the global south, which largely bear the brunt of what this means. Now, fundamentally, climate change means that those who are most vulnerable will suffer or are at higher risk, let's put it that way, from the effects of climate change, and how we need to mitigate and adapt it has really been, sort of the global agenda. Now, for South African cities, I mean, we've been in contributing to various platforms, like you said, the C40, various cities have had multiple agendas in terms of having particular climate adaptation plans. How do you get towards particular targets, towards what is net zero and all the other sort of just transition mechanisms. In the South African context, I think it's a little bit more unique. I mean, South African cities are your largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, Johannesburg's actually one of the largest in Africa and one of the largest in the world, in terms of, Gauteng province. If you look at it in a more regional sense, in terms of what that means. So what it means is we've got to look at a number of solutions. We've got to start finding how we can adapt nature-based solutions. How do you look at, possibly new green corridors, or how do you look at, effective urban stormwater management? Or as we saw in Cape Town a couple of years ago, how do you, respond to disasters such as drought or possibly floods, as we've seen heat waves and sort of extreme weather events as well. So city diplomacy does provide that latitude. Again, we're having a climate action plan means you're setting yourself key targets towards 2030, 2040, 2050 to ensure that at the same time, while you have to develop, and this is really where in an African context or the South African context, you've got to balance development with the economy, with the environment, and with people. And finding that balance has ultimately been, where South African cities find themselves at the forefront on leading some of these African conversations as well. We've got to leapfrog, stages of development where other countries might have been 50, 60, 70 years ago. and where we now are looking at urban development to ensure that they are, greener, green infrastructure is there. How do we, make better calls for green infrastructure finance? How do we, receive these concessional finance and climate resilient finance or design standards as part of now what you build in South African cities? So it's both an opportunity and it's something that needs to be capitalized on very quickly for us to sort of leverage maximum benefits. But importantly, I think that leadership in sort of adaptation has been something South African cities have championed for, the last sort of 15 years and even longer. And that has been recognized globally. So, yeah.
Yeah. Zayd, I want to talk about this report. It was a report that was published last year where it mentioned that South Africa's urbanization increased to 69.3%. I don't have the 2025 one, unless maybe, you could, correct me on the actual stat that I've just given now. It's quite a huge urbanization that we are seeing. And of course, there are a number of factors with regards to this. Many South African citizens are coming from the townships or the rural areas to say, well, the only way that we can really make a living for ourselves is through this urbanization. My first question about this, Zayd, is infrastructure-wise, are we ready to see a larger expansion of urbanization as the years move forward? The reason why I'm asking this is that we've seen decay infrastructure, and we don't know whether our cities are ready to have this expansion of urbanization. I want you to get your take on that, Zayd.
Yeah, look, I think the point, like you raised, 7 out of every 10 people are living in cities at the moment. So South Africa is predominantly an urban country. Most of your G20 countries are at 85 or, like I said, 95% urbanized. Of course, India and China being the sort of, developing exceptions to that norm. But you're looking at massive populations in that sense. What's fundamentally important when it comes to this urbanization debate is planning for what you do not know and what you cannot sort of assume to have. Now, I think we need to sort of step back a little bit. And it's a debate that we always have to understand where we've come from. Now, South African cities are largely segregated. They were planned and designed to support the apartheid system by segregating people based on race. Now, that basically assumed that people would live in racial enclaves for as long as possible.
Yeah.
What it basically has meant was that your transportation system suffers. Your employment prospects would basically be following in terms of where you live. So South African cities come from a locational disadvantage system, right? The post-apartheid model has been to integrate South African cities. Now, to integrate South African cities, you've really got to do a number of things at once. You've got to basically ensure that there's basic services for everybody. You've basically got to ensure that services that are already existing are maintained. And you've got to then ensure that, mobility, economy, accessibility, and opportunity are linked in ways where people can find themselves as fully fledged urban citizens. Now, that basically is really the challenge that South African cities are facing. How do you ensure that infrastructure is there and is adequate for the future? But at the same time, how do you ensure that, what you have needs to be maintained? And that's a financial conversation as well. Now, one of the key things that the Urban 20, and it's in the communique, and you'll see it quite explicitly, is that it calls for saying that urbanization must be regarded as an opportunity.
Yeah.
But we have to look at levers for financial growth, and financially servicing a proper long-term infrastructure plan, and to ensure that there's green growth, that we are mitigating, effects of greenhouse gas emissions and adapting fundamentally to utilizing our resources more effectively and to plan more sustainably. Now, those are some of the key challenges that we are facing. To answer your question, do we have enough infrastructure for the future? Well, there aren't many cities that can actually claim that. You always have to plan for numbers and population and demographics that are unforeseen or unanticipated, unless it moves in the opposite direction. So it's really the perpetual challenge that South African cities are facing, but it's all cities around the world having to find ways of dealing with migration, in migration, and for citizens not yet realized as part of the urban system. They haven't been born yet, or they haven't come to the city yet, but will be there in a generation's time. So that is the ultimate sort of challenge of trying to balance out.
One final question, Zayd. What unique lessons or innovations from South African cities do you believe can inspire members of the G20? And I'd like to think, this being the final year, a global South nation will host the G20 in quite a long time. There has to be some fantastic innovations that can come out of this to really improve our cities, not just here in South Africa, not only on the continent, but across the globe.
Well, there's a few. I think the first thing is that South African cities represent a very different multi-level governance approach. Our constitutional framework essentially is built on this idea of cooperative governance. It's how engagement needs to occur. We engage at local level, we engage at governmental level, and we engage internationally or globally, or however else. Now, that cooperative multi-level model of governance, I think, is a fundamental thing that not other cities have. It's not a unique thing that other cities utilize as part of the way that type of engagement fits in. So that's firstly maybe from a sounding very bureaucratic, I suppose, puts together that framework for how we should basically conduct, sort of ordinary level of engagement. And that's not an innovation, but I think it's a lesson, in terms of how South African cities negotiated from apartheid to post-apartheid. And that is a unique experience that is probably not exceptional, but I suppose provides a... There are other more basic innovations. I mean, the just transition approach. I mean, Johannesburg, already initiated some of these just transition ideas over a decade ago in terms of linking climate change and economic projects and job creation at the same time, through some of these initiatives. And many other South African cities have followed suit as well. So there are lessons in some of the just transition initiatives. Urban finance innovation. I mean, Johannesburg, again, was one of the first cities to issue a green bond.
Okay. Zayd, unfortunately, we have run out of time.
Public-private partnerships.
Zayd, unfortunately, I have to stop you there. We have run out of time, and it seems as if your connection's slightly giving us challenge, but an absolute pleasure having you on. Shukran so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you so much for having me.
No, absolute pleasure. That's Zayd Ebrahim. He is the Urban 20 Sherpa, just discussing the work done by the Urban 20. Well, that's all we have for you here on Mzansi Welcomes the World. If you've missed today's episode, be sure to catch it on our YouTube channel. From myself, for Hospital, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.